Shabbat Shalom, welcome to my stream. My name is Hillary. This is my Torah study stream for my Going at Priestess project, and I hope you're having an excellent day. I've had a very tiring week, so I thought I wouldn't have much energy for this, but I'm actually, now that I've been getting ready, I've been getting more like hype about it. Just an FYI, this is the second stream where I've mentioned that I currently have a foster cat named Danzig, who's very sweet and is currently being very sweet, though he was being a handful about 15 minutes ago, so I might need to take a pause at some point during the stream to stop him from like chewing on something. Okay. So we're going to start with the prayer before Torah study, and then we'll get into it because it's a very big parsha. Alright, Brachat Shechina, Otenu Rach Olam, Asher Kidshatnu B'mitzvoteha, V'tzivatnu L'sok B'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Holy One, whose presence fills creation, making us holy through the sacred connective action of cultivating words of Torah. So, Vayigash, so those of you who watched my stream before, you know that I do every other Torah portion. So I didn't do last week, which was Miketz. And this is a little tricky because Miketz and Vayigash have like a cliffhanger structure. So I'm going to do some background of Miketz because it's very hard to jump into Vayigash without Miketz. So if you read the parsha last week, Joseph was imprisoned, and the cupbearer who he was imprisoned with, Joseph had asked him, like, could you put in a good word for me with Pharaoh? But the cupbearer forgot, because the cupbearer got released and got to go back to serving Pharaoh. But the cupbearer remembered because Pharaoh had these really disturbing dreams. He had one about 7 healthy cows that came out of the Nile that were then consumed by 7 gaunt and really disturbing looking cows, and then about 7 healthy shafts of grain that were consumed by like desiccated shafts of grain. But none of Pharaoh's regular magicians or the folks that he would consult about the things like this were giving him satisfactory interpretations. So Pharaoh, so cupbearer was like, hey, I know this guy that's in your prison because I was in prison with him. He interpreted my dream and the dream of this other guy that you executed, and both of his predictions came true. So Pharaoh's like, okay, I'll try this guy out. And Joseph immediately catches on to what the dream means and predicts 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And at this point, Joseph is 30, so he's been in jail for a long time. So he would have been, because he came to Egypt enslaved at 17, he would have been maybe in his early 20s if he had been in service for a couple of years before he was jailed. Or actually, he was enslaved for a few years before he was jailed. But anyway, he becomes Pharaoh's second in command because he makes such a good impression, because yet again, Joseph is really good at getting out of, making the best of whatever negative situation he's in. And so he becomes second in command. Pharaoh also gives him a wife named Asenat, and he has 2 sons with her, Ephraim and Manasseh. And we're still in Miketz. So the 7 years of plenty pass. Joseph is the one in charge of storing up all the grain. And we're about 2 years into the famine. And so he's giving out rations. So he's now maybe 39, 40, because it's been about 9 years. And who comes to Egypt looking for food but Joseph's brothers, except for Benjamin, because Benjamin, Joseph's only full brother, the only other son by his mother Rachel, stays back with Yaakov / Israel because Yaakov is very, very attached to Benjamin. But the brothers are there. Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him because he's dressed in different clothes. And my cat stood up, and he's dressed in different clothes, and then they don't expect him, to be alive even, because they know he was sold into slavery, and don't expect him to be like a high-ranking Egyptian person, and also he's He also used an interpreter to kind of like hide that he is himself, so he speaks it. They seem speaking a different language. Anyway, he treats them really harshly, and he accuses them of being thieves and all of these things. And he does this in order to kind of suss out if they've changed. Well, that's the way most people interpret it, is that he does it to suss out if they've changed. And he particularly manipulates them into bringing Benjamin with him because he wants to see Benjamin. So at the cliffhanger, the end of Miketz, Joseph's steward frames Benjamin for theft. So Joseph's steward puts his goblet that Joseph uses apparently for divination into a bag that Benjamin is taking with him that would also contain food. And then they run after Joseph, and his stewards run after them, find out it's in the bag, and say, we're gonna, well, first they threaten to kill whoever has it, and then they say that they'll enslave them. So it looks like Benjamin is going to be enslaved, and the other brothers are just horrified. So that's where we are at the beginning of Vayigash. At the beginning of Vayigash, Yehuda offers himself to be enslaved in Benjamin's place. Remember that Yehuda was the one who proposed that the brothers sell Joseph into slavery in the first place. So this is very significant that he's the one who's doing this. And Joseph takes a moment to collect himself because he's very emotional, and he's an emotional, very sensitive fella. And then he reveals his identity to his brothers, who at first don't even believe him because they're just like completely stunned. They're like, what the hell is going on? So then Joseph invites Yaakov/Yisrael and all of the descendants of his house to move to Egypt with him and have land in the region of Goshen. And Yisrael gives offerings at Beersheba on the way, and God tells Yisrael that God will be with him, and that he will be a great nation, all of the stuff that God has promised his ancestors before, and that Yosef will be the one to close his eyes. I was doing a little bit of research. Some people interpret this line as being that Yisrael will be buried in the promised land. I think it's more explicit, just like Joseph will be there when you die. He'll be with you when it's your time to end this life. And it doesn't mean everybody, he means everybody. So it's Yisrael, Rachel, Leah, the handmaids, Bilhah, Zilpah, all 12 sons, their wives, children, and some of them even have grandsons. So Israel is a great-grandfather at this point. So it's generations of people. Also specifically mentioned are Yehuda's sons Shelah, his grandsons Peretz. So Peretz also has two sons, Hezron and Chabul, and Zerah, and also Zerah. And some other folks I mentioned are Dinah and Asher Serach Ba'asher. So we'll talk about who is mentioned and who's not mentioned, because I find this very interesting. So Joseph presents some of his brothers and his father Yisrael to Pharaoh, who welcomes him to Egypt, and they settle in the region of Goshen, as I mentioned. And at the very end of Vayigash, Joseph facilitates the Egyptians selling themselves essentially into serfdom to survive, which I have very complicated feelings about, which we'll get into. Though the priests in the land of Egypt will retain their land, and everyone else is taxed at 20%. I found that to be quite interesting, because that's kind of the arrangement in ancient Israel, or at least that's the arrangement that we're told, that priests have a certain allotment, and that I think that they're taxed differently. I can't remember exactly, but it stood out to me. So I was like, this sounds familiar. So, all right. So let's start reading some selected passages. So I think this is actually in Miketz, I'm sorry. I think it's the only one I have from Miketz. Yeah. The rest are from Vayigash. But I thought it was interesting, and it's part of the story. So this is before accusing Benjamin of theft. Joseph has his brothers over for a meal, but he is overcome with emotion. So here it says, with that, Joseph hurried out, for he was overcome with feeling toward his brother, and was on the verge of tears. He went into a room and wept there. Then he washed his face, reappeared, and, now in control of himself, gave the order, serve the meal. They served him by himself, and then by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, for the Egyptians could not dine with the Hebrews, since that would be abhorrent to the Egyptians. So we talked a few weeks ago about how Joseph is more emotionally expressive than pretty much any man in Torah, which is sometimes used to interpret him as being, which is part of why he's sometimes interpreted or held on to some people as a queer icon, though he's not explicitly gay. And of course, gay men aren't necessarily more overtly emotional, but because his behavior is gender nonconforming. So this is one example of it, and that's part of why I picked out this parsha. There are other, or picked out this quote. There are other points in the parsha where he is also very emotional. I want to talk about that a bit more later, but I'm also interested in him being isolated, and the Egyptians not eating with the Hebrews, because the Egyptians wanting to maintain distance from the Hebrews is mentioned a couple of times as there being kind of this cultural gulf, and this is very demonstrative of how, the cultural gulf, but also how Joseph has to kind of assimilate to this culture, but maybe he can't assimilate entirely because he's not from it, because it's a very insular culture. So I'm going to read a little bit from Radak. And the brothers separately and the Egyptians separately again, for the Hebrews were eating meat, as we know from the instructions to slaughter meat which had been issued in verse 15. Egyptians did not eat sheep or goats, and the only reason they raised these animals was for their wool and their milk. According to Rashi, and evidence cited in Torah Shlema 992:5, the reason why the Egyptians did not eat sheep was that they considered sheep a deity, and it was inconceivable for them to consume their deities. And there are certainly animal head gods in the Egyptian pantheon. So this is quite interesting, commenting on possible cultural differences here. I'm always kind of skeptical about things like this. They're not from the perspective of the culture, and I don't know enough about ancient Egypt to know if this is accurate to ancient Egyptian culture at the time when this might have taken place. So I kind of take this with a grain of salt. But it is interesting to think about, and how Joseph probably has to code switch a lot in this environment. So this is where Joseph is threatening to enslave Benjamin, and Yehudah speaks up. This is Yehudah speaking. Your servant, my father, said to us, as you know, my wife bore me 2 sons, but one is gone from me. And I said, alas, he was torn by a beast, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and he meets with disaster, you will send my white head down to Sheol in sorrow. This is Yehudah quoting Yisrael. Now if I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, since his own life is so bound up with his, when he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will send the white head of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in grief. Sheol is like some kind of afterlife. I think we don't know a ton about, actually. It's kind of like an ancient word to refer to the afterlife. Now your servant has pledged himself for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, I shall stand guilty before my father forever. Therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be witness to the woe that would overtake my father. This is a very moving part. And again, Yehudah is the one that sold Joseph into slavery. He is offering himself. And here he recounts, in a very emotional way, how Yisrael is attached to Benjamin, and also alludes, of course, to Joseph, because he doesn't know he's speaking with Joseph at this time. Alludes to him to having lost another child by the same wife. And he takes responsibility, and I think this shows that to Joseph that Yehuda has changed, and that he in turn has a change of heart. So there's a lot of really good family drama. Genesis is great for family drama, and we get a whole lot of it here. This is another emotional part where Joseph needs to take a moment to have an emotional reaction. It's not long after what Yehuda just said. Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone withdraw from me." So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear, and so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still well?" His brothers could not answer him, so dumbfounded were they on account of him. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me." And when they came forward, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, he whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you." Okay, so much going on here. So again, we have the very emotional Joseph, who doesn't hesitate to, well, he does try to cover up his feelings, but at this point he just like can't stop it. It just comes out of him. And he needs to be alone with his brothers, but he's crying so loud that like people in other rooms hear, and the Pharaoh finds out anyway, which ends up being fines. But the first thing he asks about is his father. And he has, before this, already asked about the well-being of his father, but he reiterates it. I think maybe because he wants to be sure he gets the true answer. And also, he wants to ask as himself. He's previously asked as like a curious stranger. I was like, "Oh, how is the health of your father?" But he wants to know what's really going on. He doesn't just want to ask in like a casual, polite way. And his brothers, like, whether out of fear or whether they just don't quite believe that it's him, they're initially silent. And he also tries to comfort them to try not to make them feel overly guilty, though they frankly deserve to feel guilty for what they did to him. Because he wants to have a positive reunion with them. And also, Joseph recognizes his role that he's had in the world by coming to Egypt and essentially saving this entire region from famine. So this is, I think, really at the crux of Joseph and his importance as a figure, his talents, and he is so maligned for being sensitive, for being a little strange earlier on in his life, and he suffers so much. And he is finally rewarded for it because his talents are what saves his family and basically the entire society that they live in. So this is a vindication for him, and he could be really arrogant about it if he wanted, but that's not in his nature. He recognizes that he is an agent of God and that things happen in a certain way so he could get to this point. It's a very beautiful passage. There's very beautiful emotional stuff in here. And I want to talk a little bit about the language here. Because Joseph asks, okay, he says, "Ani Yosef, I'm Yosef, ha'od avi chai," which literally means, "Is my father alive?" So I appreciated some commentary from Tur HaAroch, yes. Is my father still alive? Even though he had asked the same question already in 44:27, and the brothers had answered in the affirmative, his question now concerned the state of his health, not the mere fact that Yaakov was still alive. So I think that's why they translated "is my father well," because they're using contextual clues, yes, in their translation. The word chai, therefore, has to be equated with healthy. I actually don't know how to pronounce the word. I'm sorry, my Hebrew's kind of. It is also possible that he did not really ask this question in order to receive additional information, but merely to have an opening to speak to the brothers instead of, as until now, about your father, but about my father, i.e. their common father. This was a ploy to establish close personal contact with his brothers. So that's nice. Here's more crying. I don't know. I just I just pick all the parts where Joseph cries because I find, I don't know. I guess because he shows so much emotion, and it's one of the things that makes him exceptional, but also because I find all these passages very moving. So this is after what we previously read. With that, he embraced his brother Benjamin around the neck and wept. Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. Only then were his brothers able to talk to him. And this is a part where you could chalk this up to Joseph being super emotional, but this particular part actually mirrors things we've seen earlier in Genesis with other brothers, where they have this emotional coming together. I'm reminded of Yitzchak and Ishmael. Okay, that wasn't described as emotionally, but they did come together to bury Avraham when he passed away, which I really like, even though it's only mentioned in passing. What it really resembles is Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov and Esav coming together when Yaakov comes back to Canaan with Rachel and Leah. He's afraid Esav is literally going to kill him because right before he left years ago, he along with his mother conspired to take Esav's birthright, and Esav had literally threatened to kill him before he left. But when they come back, they embrace just like this, and they also cry on each other, which I think is just, it's just very moving and very sweet. And often we don't get a lot of, again, Joseph is a bit of an exception, but often we don't get these overt emotional displays from men in the Hebrew Bible. And so it's nice to see this. It's very moving to see this bond between brothers, especially having been through so much, being separated, having so much conflict before they parted. I mean, like really horrific stuff. And so we get to see Joseph embrace his brothers, and it's very beautiful. I have a little bit of commentary about Joseph embracing Benjamin, so I'm going to read this. This is from Rabbeinu Bachya, Bereshit 45:14, 1-2. Quote, he fell on the neck of his brother Benjamin. This verse tells us that Joseph embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin embraced his brother Yosef, by each one falling on the other's neck, a customary gesture amongst brothers who wanted to demonstrate their fondness for each other. Solomon refers to such an embrace in Song of Songs 8:1, where he wrote, if only I could embrace you as I would embrace a brother who has nursed at my mother's breast. The intimate relations between brothers of the same mother are also spelled out in the Torah in Deuteronomy 13:7, where the Torah describes a secret seduction to idolatrous practices by someone who is the brother of the second party by the same mother. Evidently, the Torah considers the bond between two sons of the same mother as stronger than a similar bond by two sons of the same father. The reason our verse refers to two necks, there are a couple interpretations on Safari about why it seems to refer to Benjamin having two necks or something, or I don't know, it's a little strange. Is that a person's neck consists of two parts? Sorry, I don't know how to read those without the vowels, but that the neck consists of two parts. Jeremiah 2:27 distinguishes between these two parts in Hebrew of the neck, the rear of the neck and the part of the neck facing forward. Sides of the neck are also known. Hold on. I think I might not read this whole thing. Whatever, I'll just read the whole rest of it. A midrashic approach to the plural form of the necks. Joseph wept when he foresaw the temple in Benjamin's territory would twice be destroyed. The reason that the neck of a person evokes the image of the temple is that it is the highest part of the body, and the temple was also erected on a mountain. When Benjamin wept, he thought of the destruction of the tabernacle at Shiloh, which was situated in the territory of Yosef, or Ephraim specifically, and which was also slated to be destroyed. So there are a couple, I found a couple of interpretations on Sephora that said Yosef and Benjamin crying, and specifically the mention of two necks or different sides of Benjamin's neck is actually about the destruction of the first and second temple, which I think is a stretch. I'm going to be honest with you. I think it's a stretch. I think that's a lot. But it was quite interesting, a very unusual interpretation, in my opinion. Maybe it's in some circles that's a very conventional opinion, but I'd appreciate the insight into this particular gesture of brothers weeping on each other's necks, and also the bond of full brothers in a society where a lot of people would have had half siblings because some men had multiple wives. So that was quite interesting. So let's move on. Okay, so this is when the family of Yisrael, all his descendants, are moving out of Canaan to Egypt. So Yisrael set out with all that was his, and he came to Beersheba, where he offered sacrifices. There goes my foster cat. Hopefully he's not getting into trouble. He came to Beersheba, where he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Yitzchak. God called to Yisrael in a vision by night, Yaakov, Yaakov. He answered, Hineni, or I'm here. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Fear not to go down to Egypt, for I will make you there into a great nation. I myself will go with you to Egypt, and I myself will also bring you back. And Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So again, there's a lot of foreshadowing of going down to Egypt. It's going to be a very significant time for the ancient Hebrews. And again, this moving message from God that Joseph will be there when Israel passes on. Okay, so after this, there's a whole big list of who all goes to Egypt, which is pretty much everybody. It's just like everybody in Yisrael's household, but they like to be specific. And there are a couple instances that I think are very interesting about who is mentioned and how they're mentioned. So in Genesis 46:12, Yehuda's sons are listed. So it says Yehuda's sons, Onan, Shelah, Peretz, and Zerah. But and Onan had died in the land of Canaan. And Peretz's sons were Hezron and Hamul. Hamul, not Hamul. Yeah, Hamul is his name. So it's weird that and Onan are mentioned when they're dead. We know they're dead. So obviously they didn't go down to Egypt. So they're mentioned to say that they didn't go down to Egypt because they were dead. So Shelah goes down. Shelah's sons are not mentioned. So we don't know what that's about. Peretz and Zerah are mentioned. Tamar is not mentioned. And I tried to find, and granted, I'm no expert at researching Talmud and biblical commentary, but I tried to find reference of whether or not Tamar went down to Egypt, because I'm really curious. And no one seems to care about where Tamar is, and I want to know. So, but a lot of women, including some daughters, are mentioned. So I feel like if she did go down to Egypt, it would have been mentioned. So maybe once Tamar had those children and provided progeny for and Onan through Yehuda in levirate marriage, which we got into. If you want to read up on that, watch the video from my last stream, because I got into levirate marriage a lot. Maybe after that she dipped. Like maybe she remarried to someone else, which I kind of can't blame her for, because she had to deal with all this drama in Yehuda's household that she didn't want to deal with. Because he refused to marry her to Shelah after and Onan died, which is what he was obligated to do. So maybe, yeah, so maybe Yehuda took his sons by Tamar with him. Yeah, and then Peretz apparently got married, so good for him. This is very important because Peretz is an ancestor to King David. So that's what we got. I think there's a lot that's unspoken there. But I have a bit of commentary from Orach HaChaim, who also wonders what I've been wondering. Why were people who had died already listed as part of the family which traveled to Egypt? Good question. Besides, why did the Torah repeat here again that these sons of Yehuda had died in the land of Canaan, something that we are all familiar with? Furthermore, why does the Torah write, here's where it gets into grammatical stuff in Hebrew. It writes, where I gotta try and find it. It's the part where I think it's the part where it refers to. It's a part where it starts referring to parrots. This is parrots, and these are parrots as sons. And the wording, or Hachaim is curious about the wording of it. We found all the other grandchildren introduced using different wording. Perhaps it's all connected with the concept of the levirate marriage. This word is aimed at reestablishing a presence on earth for the brother who has died without leaving children. In our instance, Yehuda performed this commandment instead of his son Shelah. It was Yehuda's duty to bring Aaron Onan's offspring to Egypt. The Torah tells, so for a review with levirate marriage, Yehuda is the biological father of Peretz and Zerah, but he, in the customs of levirate marriage, when he had sex with Tamar and got her pregnant, it was essentially for Aaron Onan, who had died and not been able to produce offspring. The Torah tells us by means of an unusual syntax that Yehuda performed this duty by bringing Chetzronen and Chamul, his grandchildren, to Egypt. These two were to be considered the replacements of Aaron Onan respectively. I think this is a note from the translator in the brackets. If I understand the author correctly, he argues that because Yehuda belonged to a generation prior to that of Shelah, the surviving brother of Aaron Onan, who should have performed the levirate marriage, only the second generation, i.e. Peretz's children, were the reincarnates of Aaron Onan. Had Shelah himself performed the rites of, I assume that that's the word for levirate marriage, his first two children would have been considered as the reincarnates of Aaron Onan. And all this is hinted, and Or Chaim thinks that's all hinted at with the wording. Just reading a lot into it. But I think that's quite interesting. So there are more people coming down to Egypt that I want to talk about. So, going on a little bit, those were the sons whom Leah bore to Yaakov in Padan Aram, in addition to his daughter Dinah, persons in all, male, female, 33. So Dinah, I think I misspoke last time I streamed and I said that Dinah is not mentioned after the incident in which she is raped by Shechem and then her brothers kill like an entire village of people in retaliation. Really horrific instance. That parsha was not one of the parshiot that I did because I do every other one, like the particular parsha where that happens, but I did mention it in other instances. And I said that was the last time Dinah was mentioned. It is not. I think this is. So we know she's still alive when they go down to Egypt. By now she would be an adult. She'd probably be... Is she older than Joseph? I think she's older than Joseph. Maybe about the same age. I'm not entirely sure. I would have to check. But she's definitely an adult at this point. So if we know she survives, it suggests to me that she did not marry or have children of her own, which indeed after the entire kerfluffle of her being sexually violated and her not getting married in that instance, because they looked like she was going to be married in that instance. And again, Dinah's opinion on the whole thing is never spoken. We don't know if she's okay with marrying that guy with Shechem. We don't know if she's completely against it. I think most people think she would be against it because it was non-consensual. Though a lot of the boundaries of what we consider consent in a modern context with an ancient context are very different. And literally, she doesn't say anything, so we really just don't know. I think, but seeing her name again is kind of moving and also sad at the same time. Because I like to know she's still around and she had a life after that, but I'm sad that we don't know what it is. And that it sounds like she was not able to marry and have children. And I know I'm focused a lot on her marrying and having kids, but the reason I am is there's not really a way in this culture for her to advance herself without getting married and having kids, unfortunately. I'm gonna try to wave to my neighbor. Hello. So it is significant that she doesn't, because it's not like she's going to be like starting her own business, you know, like this is what in this time in this culture she would have had the avenues to do, and she probably didn't get to do it. Anyway, I was hoping to find some commentary about Dina, and I couldn't find any because I don't think the rabbis are as interested in her as I am. The rabbis are very fixated on a completely different thing, the fact that the number of people listed as descendants of Leah and Yaakov seems to be off by one. That's the thing that they care about, which is not the thing I care about at all. But I'm going to read a little bit from that. This is Rashi. 33. In the enumeration above, you'll find only 32. The one whose name is omitted is Yocheved, who was born between the walls just as they entered the border city. As it said, Numbers 26:59, Yocheved, the daughter of Levi, whom her mother bore to Levi in Egypt. She was born in Egypt, but she was not conceived in Egypt, according to Bava Batra 123. So, and there are also other explanations for who the extra person might be. I like this the one the best. You're probably not surprised because it provides more context to a female Hebrew Bible character that we don't necessarily get a ton of information on, and as you've probably surmised by watching any of the stream or any of my other streams, I like to dig into women who don't have a whole lot written about them and who deserve to have more. So if we're going to talk about, if we're going to, I'm going to be honest, I'm just not as interested in the minutia of things like the different numbers of things, and to me, that's not the most exciting stuff. To me, the most exciting stuff is like figuring out the society and like what the mores are and like how that changes how people behave, how the people behave in response to it, and the emotionality and how people relate to each other. That's the stuff that's exciting for me. So I didn't even bother to count up that there were 33 people. The rabbis really care and how many people are like, who is this extra person? So here's one interesting explanation is that it was Yocheved, and she was, and I see in some interpretations of either she was a fetus inside of her mother, or that she was born outside of the gates. So she was just like an extra person that they got going in. So that's interesting. So I think this is the last case where I want to highlight somebody who's mentioned in the list of people who went down to Egypt. So it's Genesis 46:17. Asher's sons, Imnah, what is Yimnah? Yeah, Yimnah, Yishva, Yishvi, and Beria, and their sister Serach. Beria's sons are Hever and what's Malkiel? Yeah, Malkiel. So Serach. So we have another instance where one daughter is mentioned. There might be more daughters, but again, I subscribe to the theory that when we have a list of sons, there probably were daughters, but they weren't considered to be significant enough to mention. Because just statistically, there would be more daughters than there appear to be. So when a daughter is mentioned, it's because she's significant in some way. And I think this is true for Dina. And I think this might be true for Serach. And Serach is an interesting biblical character because there's a lot of kind of legend built around her, because there is a Serach mentioned at the time of the Exodus from Egypt, much later. It is theorized that it's the same Serach, and that she just lived to be hella old, and that she was there when the Jews arrived in Egypt and also when they departed, and that she knew where Yosef's coffin was, so they could take him to the Promised Land. Yeah, so this is a mention, just a mention of Serach bat Asher. Hopefully we'll get to talk about more, but there she is. That's all we get right now. But there she is, and she exists. So, yeah. So, okay. So this is when right when they come into Egypt, all of Yisrael's family. He is Israel, had sent Yehuda ahead of him to Yosef to point the way before him to Goshen. So when they came to the region of Goshen, Yosef ordered his chariot and went to Goshen to meet his father Yisrael. He presented himself to him, and, embracing him around the neck, he wept on his neck a good while. Then Yisrael said to Yosef, "Now I can die, having seen for myself that you are alive." I don't know why I switch between Joseph and Yosef, but I just do. So quite significant. Again, he sends Yehuda ahead, who again is responsible for Joseph being enslaved in Egypt, but who also argued for Benjamin's release. Also acted kind of as a leader in this part of the story. And we have more weeping on the necks, just lots of weeping on the necks, very emotional. And Yisrael saying this very bittersweet thing, "Now I can die, having seen for myself that you are still alive." Because he didn't, he thought Joseph was dead for so many years. He initially didn't believe that he was alive when the brothers told him that he was alive. And then he really gets to see him. His beloved son is still alive, and it's very, very moving. A lot of these parts I pick out not because they have like a hidden meaning. It's just because I think that they're really moving and beautiful. Okay. A little bit later on, then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and tell the news to Pharaoh, and say to him, 'My brothers and my father's household, who were in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds, they have always been breeders of livestock. They have brought with them their flocks and herds and all that is theirs. So when Pharaoh summons you and asks, "What is your occupation?" you shall answer, "Your servants have been breeders of livestock from the start until now, and both we and our fathers, so that you may stay in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are abhorrent to Egyptians." This is interesting to me because there's another instance where there's this cultural gulf between the Egyptians and the Hebrews, where the Egyptians don't want to eat with them, but also the whole shepherd lifestyle they just think is gross. And again, I take that in terms of actual historical ancient Egypt, I would take this with a grain of salt and want to learn more, because this might be a very fractured picture of the reality, but within the story, that's the information that we get. And so I think that's quite interesting, and Joseph is very aware of this particular, I guess, prejudice. So he's helping his family kind of negotiate it and like say up front that this is who you are, and then we'll get the good grazing land in Goshen. It's fine, but just so you're aware that like it's not something the Egyptians are into. And I wonder if this cultural gulf is what leads to the Hebrews being oppressed because there are very negative stereotypes about them. This Pharaoh doesn't seem to care. Like later on in the parsha, I don't think I quoted this in the study sheet. No, I didn't. But Joseph brings Yisrael and some of his brothers to meet Pharaoh, and they do as he says. He says, "Yeah, we're shepherds," and Pharaoh, welcomes them to Egypt, and he's like, "Have this great grazing land. This is where you live now." And maybe this is because of what Joseph did for Egypt, or maybe this Pharaoh is just a bit more open to other cultures, and because like, I mean, if you want to be a good leader, if you want to be even run an empire, frankly, it makes sense to the most successful empires, not to say that they're just, because generally they're not, they're very oppressive, but the ones that are smart incorporate different cultures and allow people to observe their local customs, but do so within the empire. So maybe he's just smart that way. Maybe he is just not so prejudiced, because we find out later that the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph is the one that starts to actually oppress the Hebrews. But anyway, it's an interesting cultural comparison, and tells us a bit about what Joseph's life is, having to kind of code switch, having to be aware, of this culture that he lives among, but that he's not really a part of. Oh, excuse me. All right, and so here towards the end of the parsha, Well, let's just get into this. This is Genesis 47:14. Joseph gathered in all the money that was to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, as payment for the rations that were being procured. And Joseph brought the money to Pharaoh's palace. When the money gave out in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, lest we die before your very eyes, for the money is gone." And Joseph said, "Bring your livestock, and I will sell to you against your livestock if the money is gone." Essentially, he's putting them into debt. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the stocks of sheep and cattle and asses. Thus he provided them with bread that year in exchange for all their livestock. And their livestock, of course, would be like their material assets. And when the year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We cannot hide from my lord that, with all the money and animal stocks consigned to my lord, nothing is left at my lord's disposal save our persons and our farmland. Let us not perish before your eyes, both we and our land. Take us and our land in exchange for bread, and we with our land will be serfs to Pharaoh. Provide the seed, that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become a waste." So Joseph gained possession of all the farmland of Egypt for Pharaoh, every Egyptian having sold his field because the famine was too much for them. Thus the land passed over to Pharaoh, and he removed the population town by town, from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests did he not take over, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh had made to them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Whereas I have this day acquired you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you to sow the land. And when harvest comes, you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be yours as seed for the fields and as food for you and those in your households, and as nourishment for your children." And they said, "You have saved our lives. We are grateful to my lord, and we shall be serfs to Pharaoh." And Joseph made it into land law. And Joseph made it into a land law in Egypt, which is still valid, that 1/5 should be Pharaoh's, only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. Sorry, that's a really long thing to read. But basically, the people were already in trouble, but Joseph facilitated their debt and their serfdom and having them not have full control over their own land. And I feel we're complicated about this. Because it's not great. I mean, and this is one of those things where you could go back and forth. You could be like, well, within the structure that Joseph was working in, this was the best he could do for them because Pharaoh wouldn't have allowed him to do otherwise. Or I could just say, like, he screwed these people over. It depends, because I think this is kind of a representation of that eternal debate about if you become part of the oppressive structure, what can you do within it? What is the way to make life better for people? Or will you inevitably just be absorbed by the oppressive structure and not be able to do anything from within? I do have an interpretation here from Tur Ha'aroch. Quote, "Acquire us together with our land in return for bread." They asked Joseph to also acquire their bodies as slave labor, and this is confirmed when Joseph told them in verse 23 that he had indeed acquired both their soil and their bodies on Pharaoh's behalf. Seeing that this has all been spelled out by the Torah in unmistakable language, what do the words in verse 20, "Joseph acquired all the soil of Egypt on Pharaoh's behalf," add to the information we have already received? In fact, that verse seems to contradict what we read in both verse 19 and 23, in that it speaks only of soil and not bodies having been sold. The reason for the insertion of this verse was to show that although the Egyptians were willing and eager to sell their bodies, Joseph did not acquire their bodies, as he considered the personal freedom of the body of a human being as of paramount importance. But he established a system of sharecropping, former landowners being legally obligated to work the lands in question on behalf of Pharaoh, but sharing the success or failure of the annual crops to the extent of 80%. When he did say to them in verse 23, "Here I have acquired you," he refers to the entitlement to their labor, not to their bodies being owned and subject to resale to other human beings, as was the custom in the United States until 1866. Very interesting addition here. Moreover, Joseph's concern for human rights, in quotes, was such that instead of allocating to Pharaoh 80% of the fruits of their labor, he allocated only 20 to Pharaoh, the remainder belonging to the farmer who would work the land. The expression, "I have acquired you," is justified as the farmers were not allowed to leave the land or offer their labor to someone else. Yeah, so that's a favorable interpretation, and this kind of goes towards Joseph using his power to make a overall better situation for people who are suffering, even if it's maybe not the ideal one. That's all I got for today. Phui. Sorry, I'm just a little bit tired today. Thank you very much for joining me. And it went almost an hour. Hey, let me see if I can persuade my cat to get on camera. Hey, come here. Say hello to people. Sorry, you're probably getting a lot of extraneous. This is Danzig. This is my foster cat. He's being a pretty good boy. You were good all stream, Danzig. Good job. He's a very sweet boy. He might get adopted in the next couple weeks. I want to give him a little cameo. You might not get to see him, but he's a sweet boy. Anyway, you can go do your nonsense. Thank you for hanging out. So thanks for joining me. Shabbat shalom. Bye.